Hey everybody, and welcome back to the Tonic Accord podcast. I'm Alex Kapitko, joined by my friend and co-host Drew Nepley. Drew, how you doing today?
Hello, everyone. Staying safe.
So today we have one of our reoccurring guests coming back, Grayson Forsberg. If you guys don't remember, he's been on, I think, 3 times already. And he lives in Sacramento, where he's working at the Capitol. He's a law school student, and he writes for the Common Sense Chronicles. So, Grayson, welcome back. How's your day going?
It's going. It's great to be back always. Sitting in the apartment like usual.
Yeah, how's the quarantine life?
Oh, it's not obviously not like Spain, but people are still going out to Safeway and some walking their dogs and stuff. But I thought it was interesting when I went to Safeway the other day. There's like a line, so every time, I think we were talking about this earlier in the week, but there's a line where one person goes out, one person goes in, one person goes out, one person goes in.
Yeah, it's been happening for us too.
I've been seeing like most places they put like tape down. They'll put tape down so you have to stay behind the tape, so you're always a certain amount of feet from people. Yeah, it's crazy.
Yeah, they got like a little plexiglass thing or something like that in front of the cash registers.
I bet you they'll keep those after this dies down. I bet you people are gonna be like, you know what? I've had enough people spitting in my face. Let's keep those guards.
Yeah.
Yeah, I've started walking the dog we have, which is 12 years old, and he doesn't even like to walk, but it's the only way I can leave the house. So this poor dog is like, screw my life. He's like, I just want to be on the couch, but all these people are taking me out, but it's the only way to leave.
You're my ticket out of the house.
Yeah. Well, so as much as coronavirus is going on right now, I wanted to bring Grayson on mainly today, just so we can talk about another topic that's big, but has definitely not been mentioned with all this other chaos, which is A, the Green New Deal, and then B, kind of just the division amongst the climate change debate in the United States. So I think it's a good time to talk about a less discussed topic, you guys.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the Green New Deal is something that was a hot topic about a year ago, and it kind of dropped off quickly because of a vote, and we'll get into that vote later. But I think it's something that I think is going to be reoccurring. And especially if we do have a change in administration, you're going to start hearing about environmental legislation again pretty soon. So we wanted to kind of get into it.
Yeah, Grayson, so what do you think about the Green New Deal? I know over the years you and I've kind of brushed on it, but I've never really heard your full thoughts. So I don't know, maybe give our listeners a 101 on the thoughts of Grayson here.
Sure thing. When it first came out, it immediately you see all the headlines on conservative or liberal media and praising it or just detesting it. And obviously, since it was kind of AOC's thing, there's that was kind of the highlight. And whether you're an AOC fan or not, kind of got your first impressions on it. But I think the idea is, definitely something that's it's not a bad idea to talk about wanting to change our policies when it comes to the environment. I'm sure that there's a lot of research and there's a good consensus on both sides of the scientific kind of arena that agree that we are definitely contributing to the CO2 levels and emissions and all that stuff. But I think that it's a good idea, but I think how they went about it, obviously, I more disagree with kind of how the left side goes about wanting to, get this thing saying that we're gonna it's going to be irreversible in 12 years or whatever Ocasio-Cortez said, I think a year ago. All this climate alarmism is just, if you want to sit down and have a really good educated conversation on what to do, let's come up with a plan that's viable and not just, it was basically, to me, it seemed like a wish list of what the government wanted to kind of take over. When it comes to more like the private sector and stuff, it's just more government control, and a lot of it didn't even really have anything to do with climate change, like guaranteed jobs or $15 minimum wage or universal health care. It's like, well, what does this have to do with climate change? I think it was just a big wish list of what they wanted to kind of, what policies they wanted to push.
That's a pretty fair criticism, and I wanted to just kind of address that so everyone else that listening is on the same page of what the Green New Deal is. It was first of all, the fact that you said it was kind of a wish list, I do agree there. It was less, it didn't really have a policy structure. It was more of a large, broad, ambitious goal setting thing that had three parts, which was climate, like affecting the way we view the climate and the industries that are affected by the climate, jobs, and then social equity. So you're right that it was a pretty these big three pillars were pretty ambitious, and I do think that was kind of what killed it off in the beginning, was just how ambitious it was, especially in a Republican-controlled government. So I mean, everyone kind of knew, including Democrats like Dianne Feinstein, that this was going to be dead in the water.
Yeah. I mean, I also think that it's the timing which is important with this Green New Deal as well. AOC, Congresswoman Ocasio-Cortez, she was not the first person to coin this or create it, but she popularized the name and idea after the midterm elections in 2018, when the Sunrise Movement, which is a youth activist group, made this a known issue and a topic, right? And I think the problem is that AOC is a divisive figure, and because she's become the poster child of this, I think a lot of people have a very divided view of this. You either like it or you hate it, just the way a lot of Americans feel about AOC. And I think what you're both saying is completely correct, that it is a laundry list of needs. And I think that's where it's going to get more difficult, because I understand by trying to get to less carbon emissions by 2050, but then they're also throwing in, yes, minimum wages, healthcare ideas. And then also for me, the hardest part is the economic justice part of it, where they're trying to tackle poverty, income inequality, and racial discrimination. And that's the part where I think it's hard to put a number on that, and that's hard to put a policy on that. And to me, it just sounds like a very optimistic, idealistic plan that maybe is good in theory, but could be very hard to bring us all to actually do something.
Well, it might take a crisis, right? I mean, it's a Green New Deal, not just like an environmental bill. Like the whole New Deal thing, like the New Deal in FDR's time was a pretty broad, ambitious deal, and it born out of a crisis, the Great Depression. It might take kind of a crisis, and I would argue personally that we are in that crisis, the environmental crisis, to push us towards something like this. Do I think that Ocasio-Cortez is the best proponent of this bill? No, but I do think that the government should take some drastic changes in the way we structure our energy to combat climate change.
Yeah, I can completely agree. I wouldn't say it's like a crisis, kind of like what's the coronavirus or something like that, but it's definitely something that it's just because over 100 years, let's say, we're gonna be changing our climate, and probably in a negative way. And it's easy to say, oh, it's 100 years down the road, it's gradual changes, let's put it on the back burner. But because it doesn't affect my life currently at the moment. But like you said, yeah, it's something that we definitely need to address, and it's good to get discussion out there. But that type of, like, what type of discussion is that? And it's kind of sad that you try to bring out this deal to get some shed some light on the climate crisis or climate change, but even when I think Ocasio-Cortez's old campaign manager, Saikat Chakrabarti, I don't think I'm pronouncing his name incorrectly, but if I am, I apologize. He even said that when this first came out, when they were drafting this plan, it had really nothing to do with climate change. It was basically just a government, it's a kind of a shift of control away from the private sector to the government. and kind of a reallocation of wealth, or a wealth redistribution. And it's, I think that if you want to talk about those things, they should be in separate plans. And she kind of just wanted to, seems like, morph a whole bunch of, like I said earlier, wish list stuff into this, I think it's 14 pages, like this 14-page plan. And it's like a bill is law, and when you just want to put, like, it seems like it was a first draft.
It does.
And it's like, you don't put a first draft sort of paper that you could write a 14-page paper in college, but you don't put that out as legislation. That's a good plan to talk about, but then you come talk it out, and then you formulate a real plan, a real bill. And I think the Green New Deal wasn't that.
Now, I do want to say, though, like, because I think you're right, and I agree with most of everything you said there, but I think, like Drew had mentioned earlier, the plan isn't much like the New Deal after the Great Depression. This isn't meant to be just a one-step environmental policy. It is a mix of different pieces of legislation. And I think the reason why they're talking about an overhaul of both economics, healthcare, wages, workers, and the environment all comes from the research that they used for this report, which showed that the U.S. could lose billions of dollars by the end of the century because of climate change, and that carbon emissions needed to be dropped significantly to do that. And so I think that's what this more is about trying to do, is try to answer the question of how do we prepare industry to be able to manage some of these costs. I think that's more of the issue going forward, but because it was so horribly written at first, there's a lot of uncertainty,
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, Noah Kaufman, who used to be one of Obama's deputy directors for, hold on, I have it right here. It was Associate Director of Energy and Climate Change, Noah Kaufman. He kind of said it's hard to analyze the Green New Deal because you can't use policy analysis if you don't have policy. Like you said, it was these big wish lists, but it didn't really have a lot of concrete policy. And again, I think it's like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. She's a very vocal, very progressive liberal that is, unlike other freshman congressmen and women, she's been pushing these big, ambitious bills almost kind of to the detriment of her image. Because, even leaders like Nancy Pelosi and Dianne Feinstein are like, you realize what you're doing is impossible. And like you're a freshman congresswoman that's trying to create this large New Deal with no real policy behind it. I understand the effort, and I think it's a conversation that needs to be had. I do think there needs to be major structural change, but I think that the Green New Deal that we're looking at from a year ago doesn't have any of the real meat behind it that people can clinch onto, and that's led to a lot of problems with the analysis. So first of all, the price tag. I want to kind of get into the price tags of this. The big one that was touted over the media was from the American Action Forum, and they priced it as somewhere over the next 10 years, somewhere between 51 and 93 trillion. That's with a T, trillion dollars.
Yeah, I saw similar numbers even in a Bloomberg article, and obviously we know Bloomberg's not a very conservative site, but it's like $93 trillion. There's always that answer, or that question that you see conservatives always ask, and even liberals as well. It's just like, how do we pay for that?
Right. Right. I mean, and that's probably the 93 trillion is the one that got touted the most, especially among like right-wing media circles, again, because it's the highest number.
Right.
It's a pretty scary number. Now, other estimates are still in the trillions, right? Robert Pollin, economist from University of Massachusetts Amherst, he says it's more like 18 trillion over 30 years. Edward Barbier, an economist from Colorado State University, suggests it'd be more like $1 trillion a year for an indefinite amount of time. That's still a lot of money. I mean, we just saw a stimulus package signed for $2 trillion, and that turned everyone's heads, right? Now you're talking about $1 trillion a year, and that's a low estimate. It is still serious money, no doubt. But I do think that 93 trillion number is hard to actually accept because, again, we don't have a lot of policy to like concretely look at. And then on top of that, like you mentioned earlier, how it's a bundle of a ton of different things. More than 80% of the cost would be the social programs, like going to a single payer healthcare system, and or these jobs programs, and most of the cost is that, and less so the environmental aspect.
Right. And also, like, I think the big issue is that this whole plan is relying on a lot of testy math and economics right now. And I think that if it was, say, $93 trillion in the total cost, I think they're banking on the fact that a lot of companies are going to start switching towards more renewable sources, and eventually the money will make itself back. And the problem is we just don't know enough about that yet. Like, there's a lot of reliance on the fact that everyone is going to just go towards green energy over what is happening. But I just find that hard to believe right now, because as we're seeing, obviously oil prices have tanked, like Drew and I talked about a few weeks ago. But there is a shale boom in the United States that's gone on, and there is a country and a world that is reliant on that has financial systems that are reliant on oil. And so part of me wonders if by 2050, could we really get to net zero carbons and reinvigorate our economy with only renewables? And I think they're just banking on a lot, and then they want to use this also to pay for expensive programs, like you said, Drew. And my big issue with it is it almost seems like they're trying to radically put together a lot of the progressive agendas into one plan, because you have, to me, it sounds like there's even parts of reparations that are being put into this, where they're talking about getting rid of all forms of oppression. Mm-hmm. They're talking about tackling poverty, income inequality, and these are a lot of hard things for just trying to reinvigorate the renewable sector.
Yeah, I mean, look, like, politically, especially if we're talking about the time when this first came out and was talked about the most, which was end of 2018, early 2019. I mean, politically, it made no sense. I mean, anyone that studies politics knew that this was not going to go anywhere. Republicans themselves even just kind of rushed a vote. But even that, I think even with debate or without, it was still going to be dead. Like, the politics of it doesn't make any sense. I think it was more to get people, so that they can say, hey, I supported the Green New Deal. Joe Biden and Bernie Sanders both said that they supported it and touted it in their campaigns. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez has obviously made a household name of herself, for better or worse, but she's become a household name in politics. Mm-hmm. So I think the politics of it was strange. It was dead in the water, but it popularized some new congressmen and women. It is weird. But I also think the idea of it has some validity. Like you mentioned about private industry not being able to transfer over all their stuff to renewable energy by that time. I think that's the whole point of the idea of the Green New Deal, is to push private industry towards that. Now, we've seen more private industries go more green. My own company, they got rid of printing paper because they were like, we're going all email. We don't want to print paper anymore. So I've seen it in the private sector firsthand, but we can't always trust the private sector to do that. In the past, we've had bad actors like ExxonMobil that had known about the effects of climate change since the 70s and actively lobbied against any action towards it. They knew the science, and they actively tried to bury it and lobby against it, lobbying for the U.S. to get out of the Kyoto Protocol. So my point is that there's bad actors in the private industry that we can't always trust.
Right. I think it's capitalism and has given us great strides, and it has improved the livelihood of pretty much everywhere that it's been implemented. But
sure,
there is that negative side that we're such a consumer based economy that we just always are producing more, want more, and we're just creating extra waste. And the negative side of that is that as we continue this, the environment tends to take a hit, and we, like you say, there are bad actors, especially in big multi-billion-dollar corporations that need a little bit of pushback in that arena. And it's like, I love the idea of wanting to help the planet that we live on. and I go back to this again. It's just I think with just a lot of, libertarians or moderate conservatives or people, we believe in the argument. It's just the only thing is the implementation and how you're going about it.
Sure.
I think, there was a study from the American Enterprise Institute, and yeah, it's a conservative think tank. So if, people listening want to search on, a broad spectrum of the different think tanks, that I would suggest that. But it's saying that the implementation of the Green New Deal would basically cut the global increase in like the temperature by like 0.083 to 0.173 degrees. And they tout that it's barely distinguishable from zero. I think any decrease is positive, but that's just more kind of using certain terminology. But it doesn't really, if you want to be serious about really, helping out the environment and get serious on policy, I just find it's odd that we don't, they're always touting wind and solar. Yeah, and it's like that helps, sure, but it's not reliable, as reliable as the energy we're using now. And when you want to, like you saying earlier, Alex, by 2050 getting to net zero carbon emissions, it's roughly 80% or something like that of our energy is from carbon-based, energy. I just don't understand how we can. I don't think it's sustainable. It would be sustainable to just get rid of that. But like you say, we should go towards, trying to reduce our emissions for sure. But I don't understand why. I think the Green New Deal is very against nuclear energy too. And if you're serious about really helping the environment, I don't understand why nuclear energy is so demonized on their arguments.
Interesting. While we're still on this, because I do want to talk about nuclear, but I just wanted to respond to that because I think both of you brought up something that's kind of interesting, and it brings me back. If you'll bear with me for a second, it was this Economist article back in 2017 that I actually bookmarked at the time because I thought it was an important briefing. It was one of their long articles on this exact topic. And it talks about how dramatically decarbonizing the global electricity grid would be expensive for the world financial system and potentially hazardous. And it basically talks about the most strong one I got out of this was it talks about the customers and the grid in the United States. And a lot of places, for example, like California, incentivize people to get solar panels, right? Which I think is obviously a great idea, and I think more states should go towards it. But it talks about how the more customers that generate their own electricity, the more utilities have to raise prices to the consumers that remain. So basically, if you have a shared electricity grid in California, for example, if people start going off that grid and using their own electricity without the whole mass of people doing the same, they are going to end up paying more for worse energy while other people are breaking away. So it almost creates this classism involved with environmentalism, where if you have the resources, you can find a better sense of environmental security using wind and solar, but then other people are left on a power grid that becomes more expensive and less efficient.
Well, go ahead, please.
Oh, okay, sorry. And so this gentleman, Rolando Fuentes, he does work for an energy think tank in Saudi Arabia, so obviously take this as a grain of salt, but he talks about a vicious cycle where subsidies foster deployment of renewables depress power prices, and this increases the need for financial support. So it kind of creates this just cycle of, yes, we have more of an intermittent form of energy, but in the same time, it's not completely working well with the global financial system we have, and also the consumer. Now, obviously, there are criticisms of that, but I think the problem is we need to find a balance, and the problem is that most of our energy reserves, like Grayson said, are up around 80% in fossil fuels. And so we do need to find a way to maybe wean off of that, but we can't just do it overnight. And that's why I'm concerned we're heading down just trying to force corporations to do things that might be detrimental.
A couple things to that is, one is, you mentioned how there might be kind of an inequality when who can get solar panels and who can afford that change and who can't. I think that's why if you do a major shift in the infrastructure of our energy systems, you do kind of have to have a bill that addresses social equity. Maybe not to the extent of AOC's Green New Deal, but that is a part of it, right? The economic injustice will be a part of who benefits from renewable energy and who doesn't. I think one also option is, in California, there's something called community choice aggregation, CCAs, which cities and counties take control of their energy procurement decisions. So instead of having a shareholder run company deciding energy things, right? I mean, we've seen, in California especially, PG&E has had a ton of issues with fires and liability and people kind of hating them in the state. And so these CCAs have shown that, in more than 160 towns, cities, and counties, 64 have a 100% renewable or clean energy policy as their default energy program. Now, again, like you mentioned, this is in California, where you probably have more wealthier communities making these decisions. And so, this might not translate 100% to places like Alabama or Mississippi. But it's at least a sign that if you kind of change the structure of how people get their energy and give more power to the community, they do make decisions that lead to greener results.
Yeah, that's a fair point. That's definitely a fair point. Sorry, Grayson, go ahead.
I think it is, like you said, it's a fair point. I think all this is pretty for nothing if the rest of the world, right, doesn't follow. And you can talk about poverty in the United States, but when the rest of the world, basically, I think to put a dent in climate change is to solve poverty, which is, not likely. The rest of the world it doesn't care what energy they're using or consuming, as long as they just have energy, right? Around the world, if you're going to burn something, there's not going to be solar panels or anything like that in places like Africa or maybe South America or something like that. But if they just have access to any form of energy, whether it's like coal or whatever it is, right? I think in some places they burn cow patties or cow pies
They do.
for heat, which gives off a horrible amount of CO2, but it's warmth, right? So places like, obviously this is always brought up on the more of the conservative aisle, is that, well, yeah, you can do all these things in the United States, but if China or India doesn't follow suit, then it's basically just a losing battle.
Well, the only thing about that is that, because I agree with you that you really can't have a plan unless it gets through global cooperation. But we did have that,
and we backed out of it.
Exactly, and so that's an issue I have a lot of, is because actually places like China and India have been following closer stringent regulations than the United States has.
Right. I mean, because you're absolutely right. That's the big elephant in the room is, some of the major polluters are countries like India and China and Malaysia. Hundreds of millions, billions of people of India that don't nearly have the kind of recycling and environmental policies ingrained in our society that we have. But America has regressed as far as leading by example. That's what I would argue America has been doing. I would argue that America, as far as the world scale, has been good usually at leading by example and promoting, democracy and freedom and whatever, for the most part. And that's how we do it, is we lead by example. And I think in the terms of environmentalism, especially on the global scale, we've regressed, and we've now gone out of agreements we had with the globe. And so we've made it harder on ourselves to have global cooperation. And frankly, it's because of the current administration.
Well, yeah. That's my big elephant in the room, is that I don't think the Paris Climate Accords were perfect by any means, but I think there was a lot of criticism that was unwarranted, where we need to start somewhere. We need to bring the world together to set some form of a standard towards it. And like you said, Drew, is that we've led the way for so long that I think when we step out of it, how are the rest going to follow? You know, I mean, it's crazy. I mean, this is from the New York Times. Carbon emissions in 2019 were 3.4% in the U.S. and 2.7% globally. So we have digressed. And I mean, this Gallup poll that I had shared with you guys, I don't know if you saw it, but it talks about this exact thing, is that no matter who's in the White House, if it's a Democrat, Democrats are less worried about the role of government in helping the climate. And obviously, if a Republican is in the White House, the same is the Republicans say the climate is fine. But since Trump, that has almost doubled. And I think that his administration has led the United States on somewhat of a careless route when it comes to actually being environmentally stable and friendly. And I think it's this laissez-faire market approach where it says, let's let the markets figure this out. And unfortunately, we need an international recognition that we need to lower carbon together.
Right. I think the only thing I would say, I do agree, and I think that Trump doesn't help it when he says that it's a climate hoax or something like that. It just doesn't do any good. But I don't know if this is currently correct, but I think back in August I was seeing that the United States was, or is currently still, I'm not too sure, but the world leader in clean air, with major pollutants falling nearly 75% since 1970. I think it sheds a negative image on pulling out of the agreement, but I think it's like, again, my problem with a lot of the arguments and stuff when it comes to this environmentalism and climate change arguments is that a lot of it is just grandstanding. I think. I think the Paris Agreement was kind of just, you sign a piece of paper saying, all right, we're going to do this. But countries are already doing that anyway. I didn't really ever understand the point of it. And I think it's just with this whole image, right, of if you're a denier, or if you don't agree, or you pull out of these agreements, then you're it's negative. But I think it's just like, well, you know what? We just don't care until you bring to the table a valid argument, bring to the table a valid plan. And it's right. You're right. It's negative to say we don't care. You come to us bring something true to the table and we'll listen. But there should be both sides, pushing to find a valid way to push forward. But there's just all this, like with Greta Thunberg, and propping up kids to badmouth the adults in the room. Like, kids know nothing, and I'm not going to say I'm an expert by any means, but when you push these kids to go up and speak about this stuff, you're just causing problems. You're not bringing any valid argument to the table. You're just saying, oh, you don't do this, you're bad. And it doesn't solve anything. And it's like, I think that was just kind of the Trump administration's things. Like, you're not bringing anything that's going to solve it, and so I don't care. Which, like you said, is it's negative for sure. But I think just there's always been this, sort of fake, just alarmism and pushing, all this emotion, and it's always an emotional argument. And I think that a lot of conservatives have just gotten so irritated with using emotion as a weapon that we just have kind of grown numb to it.
Really? Oh, sorry, Drew.
Well, I was gonna say, the whole Greta Thunberg thing was kind of weird. I did find it strange that she became this global icon. And I can see how if that's what you looked at, right, and you'd be, wow, that's like a weird emotional response, and why am I getting yelled at by a kid? But I would argue the only reason Greta Thunberg existed is because we've had 20 years of factual scientific evidence that people just have been ignoring. I mean, like, there is plenty of just data-based, hardline, boring evidence that there's human-caused climate change, but that hasn't gotten through to people or to half of the United States. So I agree that maybe the emotional route isn't the best way to do it, but I think it's because the boring, hardline facts aren't convincing anyone either.
That's a good point, because you say most people aren't gonna go and look through any of the facts or anything like that. Maybe it does take something like that to kind of
not Greta Thunberg, not Greta Thunberg.
No, okay, not
not Greta Thunberg.
She was strange.
I just got to say, like, I think Greta Thunberg is probably the worst thing that could happen for a good discussion on this issue, because I think, unfortunately, she's added emotion to an issue that needs to be taken seriously.
And shame. She's shamed people.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. And if you're a 50-year-old working class person who is just trying to get, feed your family and do what's right, I think being told by a girl who hasn't lived long enough to truly understand why a lot of these things have happened, I think it's a punch in the face. And I think, unfortunately, this was an NBC article, but they said that they think this new environmentalism is angrier and more protest driven. And it's going to become something that's very similar to abortion and the gun issue because of this. It's going to become more of this divisive, angry debate. And that's not what we want, because, Grayson, you'd said before, responding to what you said earlier, where a lot of conservatives say this is an overreaction and blah, blah, blah. Well, actually, in January in Davos for the Economic Forum, large companies around the world have recognized the severity of this situation, because companies from Microsoft to Lloyd's, the British financial group, have all pledged to try to cut their emissions by up to 50% by 2030. And that's because these companies, because Drew, you'd mentioned earlier, right, with the oil companies and this kind of evil private company when it comes to the climate, I think things are changing.
Well,
I
again,
think that there's.
I want to make it clear. I wasn't saying that was for every single company.
No, I know. I was just, what I'm trying to say is that I think these financial institutions like Microsoft, BlackRock, the world's largest institutional investor, these are just a few who have pledged to severely cut back on their emissions. And I think it's because they've realized there's money in this. They're going to lose significant amounts of money by 2050 if something's not done. And I think we're only going to get something to change when these companies, like we're seeing, are actually starting to recognize that there's going to be some serious profits lost and serious gains if they do the right thing. And I think that's what we have to convince more corporations in the United States, that the private and public need to work together.
Yeah, it's like, to get someone to do something, it's like, well, this is only going to benefit you. And it's a little selfish, sure, but if it gets the ball rolling, then that's probably more like, all right, down the road, this is just going to put more money in your pocket. So, which tends to be a good motivator for people. It's kind of sad that that's kind of what that's probably the negative aspect of capitalism that I'd see, is just we're so selfish in good ways that leads to better stuff. But it's kind of the underlying motivation is kind of the almighty dollar. But what you were saying earlier, that it's going to be, the environmentalism issue is becoming something of abortion or gun rights, right? I think we were talking about this earlier, Alex, outside of the podcast, but where I think, as how we were saying that, especially in current times, when you just don't feel like you belong to something, right? Like if you're religious and you go to church, you're a part of a church group or something like that. You're a part of something, and because we're social creatures. And that's when I was saying that I think these issues are almost becoming somewhat of a, environmentalism is almost becoming its own religion. I would say there's a lot of aspects that are very similar to your traditional religion like Christianity or something like that, and you have these prophets. I put that in quotation marks, but like Ocasio-Cortez or Bernie Sanders or Greta Thunberg and Elizabeth Warren. You have these warriors on the battlefield fighting for for justice and stuff. And it's become somewhat kind of like, if you're not religious or something like that, you need to find an issue or find something that is a powerful movement. And I think there's good things in that. But like I was saying earlier, there's also kind of the negative, just emotion and pain and anger. And when there's really an underlying issue that we really need to talk about, and just emotion is not rational thinking. And I think people just need to step back and look at this rationally without the anger on, or animosity towards one another.
Well, it's a very, very good point. Does anyone, we're at the 40-minute mark here, so I just want to wrap. Does anything you guys want to say before we wrap this up? Alex, any thoughts?
Well, no, I mean, I think both of you, I've enjoyed this conversation. It's been nice for sure. And, I do think that the United States is a unique country in this, because being in Europe now for several years, I've seen that this is not a divisive issue in most of the world. The right and the left in Spain agree on climate change. Boris Johnson believes in climate change in the UK. In France, both parties have worked together. France has one of the largest nuclear infrastructures in the world. It makes me wonder that I think America has always been an individualistic free market country. And it's almost like that's like this divisiveness over climate change is almost just symptomatic of our individualism, because people don't want private industry to be told they have to do something. But I think we're in this turning point where I think the private sector needs to be guided by regulations. I don't think we should nationalize. I don't like where the Green New Deal goes with that. But I think we do need to guide corporations towards a more prosperous and healthy future for everyone.
That's a good point.
Well, the viewers and listeners out there, what do you think? Do you think that the Green New Deal is something that we'll see pop up again soon? Do you think that it goes too far? Do you think that it goes not far enough? What parts and aspects of the Green New Deal do you think are even plausible? Any kind of thoughts you have on that, on the Green New Deal and the modern version of environmentalism, we would love to hear. Grayson, thank you again so much for coming on the podcast. It's always a pleasure to have you.
Yes, thank you. I really enjoyed it.
And again, another great discussion down. Tune into the Tonic Accord. We'll have another episode this week, and we'll be continuing these short catch-up episodes as well, kind of in between. So be sure to look out for those.